Lindsay Parker tore the boarding pass right in front of him, the pieces falling to the floor like a silent slap. But no one in the first-class cabin could pretend they had not seen it, could not pretend that the humiliation was just an inconvenience, could not convince themselves that it was a mistake. Evan Carter stood motionless, not speaking, not frowning, not stepping back. He simply looked at the torn ticket, then lifted his gaze, meeting the woman's cold stare with one of his own. That gaze was a mirror reflecting two worlds, one belonging to a man who had grown far too familiar with being judged by the color of his skin, and one belonging to a woman far too accustomed to believing she had the right to make such judgments. "You do not belong in this cabin," Lindsay said, her voice cold and sharp, each word dripping with contempt. "I am asking you to go back." First class froze. One beat, then another. They all knew what they were witnessing. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but discrimination laid bare, raw, blatant, unapologetic. Evan glanced down at his expensive suit, still pristine from the morning, still perfectly pressed from the meeting he had left an hour earlier. He did not look like someone who was out of place, but to people like Lindsay somehow he remained someone who did not belong. And then, with a tilt of her hand, the disaster began. Red wine spilled onto him. The deep crimson liquid spread across his shirt like an open wound, cold, sharp, startling. It soaked into the fabric, sliding down the lapel and dripping onto the floor. An accident. No. Lindsay's hand had not trembled. The motion was too perfectly timed, too natural, too practiced. No apology followed, no explanation. Gasps filled the cabin whispers, rising and falling like a quiet verdict. But Lindsay only tilted her head and lowered her voice just enough for her colleague to hear. "Does he look like someone who attends luxury meetings? At least the wine will help him remember where he belongs." A soft laugh escaped another attendant, a laugh that tightened something deep inside Evan's chest. Once again he did not frown, did not react. He only looked and remembered. In that moment, anyone who looked closely at his eyes would have seen something strange, a light belonging to someone who was no longer viewing the situation through a personal lens, but through the lens of history of generations who had endured this same casual cruelty. Generations who had walked through doors like the one he was standing in front of now, carrying invisible wounds, just like the scarlet stain burning across his suit. Evan was not standing in the reality of an isolated incident. He was standing in the stream of a larger story, a story about power discrimination systems and people who believed they had the right to decide who belonged where. And Lindsay, in that moment, had no idea she was lighting the fuse of a storm fueled by data evidence and the sharp silence of a man who had prepared for this moment for a very long time. Evan took out his phone, tapped one single number, and raised it to his ear. His voice was low, not angry, not shaken, holding only one thing: quiet power. "Caleb," he said. "Begin." The camera captured everything. One beat of silence, then the next sentence sliced through the air. Lindsay Parker just made the biggest mistake of her life. On the other end, Caleb Turner, Chief Operating Officer of Atlas Security, didn't ask a single question. He did not need to. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 months. 3 months of data models and a chain of suspicious incidents targeting executives of color. 3 months of collecting evidence of systemic discrimination within the airline. 3 months of pretending not to notice and staying silent. All for this precise moment. The final incident, the small spark that would force the entire corporation to confront a very large truth. Caleb responded with only one sentence. "It is time they see how serious this is." Evan ended the call saying nothing more, looking around, at no one offering no explanation. He simply bent down, picked up the torn boarding pass, examined it for a few seconds, then folded it carefully, as if it still held value. Beside him, the red stain continued to spread, creating an image that was both beautiful and brutal, like the lipstick mark of a crime no one dared to speak aloud. A white passenger in seat 2D whispered, "It is just wine. Just a mistake." But Evan did not hear it, because the truth is never just wine. It is a sign, a symptom, a fracture in a structure of power, a structure that believes it can control everything, even who gets to sit where. And what none of them knew was that the man standing before them was not just a passenger, not just any businessman, not a black man sitting in the wrong cabin. Evan Carter was the chief executive officer of the company, providing security technology to dozens of major corporations, including the very airline preparing to finalize its biggest contract with his firm. He had not only been humiliated, he had just witnessed living proof of everything he and his team had spent 90 days investigating, and Lindsay had done exactly what Evan needed, not for revenge, but to expose a system that had rotted from within. Evan inhaled slowly, feeling every stare on him. Curiosity, fear, annoyance, pity. He stood tall, brushed the wine from his tie, and in his eyes there was no submission, only a silent warning. "I am not the man you should have chosen to humiliate." Then he turned back toward his seat, not to sit, but to begin a confrontation that was not personal, but systemic, corporate, and rooted in justice. A storm was forming on this flight, and none of them, not even Lindsay Parker, knew they had just picked the wrong man. All they had done was touch the exact trigger of someone who had prepared for this day for a very long time. Morning light spilled across the penthouse as Evan stood before the mirror in a charcoal grey suit pressed so sharply it reflected light like steel. His face was calm, but in his eyes lay the weight of a man who had walked through too many doors slammed shut, simply because others believed his skin color did not match the role of a leader. One deep breath, one adjustment of his tie, each movement precise, like preparations for a battle he had already foreseen. He always foresaw them. Old memories returned sharp as metal brushing skin, an investor looking him over from head to toe, before asking whether there was someone more suitable to be the face of the company, a building security guard asking to recheck his badge 3 times, even though he was the chief executive officer, a suburban homeowner unable to believe he could afford the mansion he purchased with his own labor. Those cuts had forged him into a blade so sharp that no one could hurt him in the old ways anymore. His phone buzzed, a message from Caleb Turner. "The presentation is complete. Aerotech confirmed the meeting at 7. Everything is on schedule." Evan closed the phone and stepped into the living room, where his leather briefcase sat neatly placed like part of a morning ritual. The contracts he would carry today could transform the entire scale of Atlas security. But wealth was never what pushed him forward. Principles were. A promise he had made to himself as a child: if he ever gained power, he would never allow this system to hurt another person like him again. Caleb called via video. His friend's face appeared serious, but unable to hide the tension. "We are about to poke the hive, Evan." Evan answered with a steady gaze, a strange calm before the storm. "That is why we have to do it." Caleb nodded, fully aware that this was no longer Evan's story alone. It was the story of everyone who had ever been pushed out of a room they deserved to be in. The elevator lobby opened, and Evan walked into the building's luxurious space, golden light reflecting off reinforced glass and marble floors. Employees passing by glanced at him with respect, but Evan moved with the quiet composure of someone long accustomed to attention and never distracted by it. As the car pulled toward the airport, he reviewed his documents one more time each page, a testament to undeniable capability. The Aerotech contract would pave the way for Atlas Security to become a leading provider of security systems. One leap, a new era. But he had no idea that within a few hours, everything would be pushed off its original course and turned into a moral battle he would have to fight in the sky. The driver spoke. "Good luck, Mr. Carter." Evan gave a faint smile. He did not need luck. He needed justice, and he had prepared his entire life for that. At the airport security line, Evan walked through the checkpoint with the familiarity of someone who had endured countless suspicious glances from security staff. This time was no different. The scanning gaze, the request for additional, checking the strained politeness of a system, trying to hide its prejudice beneath procedure. Evan placed his belongings through the scanner without reacting, but in his mind he recorded every detail, every expression. When he reached the boarding gate, the agent looked at his first-class ticket, then raised the familiar, doubtful look at him. The "are you sure" expression he had seen so many times before. He simply gave a faint smile and held the ticket closer for scanning. The electronic gate beeped the crisp sound, confirming he belonged in first class more than anyone doubting him. Evan stepped onto the jet bridge. In his mind were numbers, strategies, and major business goals. Yet on his shoulders he carried a responsibility he did not yet fully know he would face today, the responsibility to touch a deep societal wound, expose it, and force the world to look. He did not know Lindsay Parker was standing ahead with a cold smile sharp as a blade, ready to slice through every limit of patience. And he certainly didn't know that the red wine soon to be poured onto him would do more than stain a suit. It would expose an entire system rotting beneath the weight of prejudice. Evan stepped into the aircraft, his heartbeat steady, his breathing controlled. To everyone else, he was just a man preparing for a flight. But fate was preparing a war. And a warrior does not choose the moment he goes to battle. He only chooses how he wins. Evan settled into seat 2, AI placing his leather briefcase exactly where regulations required everything neat and precise, the way a man who understood the rules better than anyone else in the cabin would do. But Lindsay Parker passed by, as if he were an item misplaced in the wrong section. She tilted her head, a cold smile forming her eyes, sharp as a cutting blade. "Are you sure this is your seat?" It was not a question. It was an accusation dressed as courtesy. Evan looked up, his gaze calm yet stronger than any verbal reply. "I am sure." Lindsay did not like that answer. Her eyes carried a deep-rooted belief that the man before her did not belong in this premium leather seat. That belief was not based on rules or data. It was based on a prejudice so ingrained that people like her never stopped to question whether they might be wrong. When Lindsay turned away, Evan noticed what everyone else missed. She served drinks to every white passenger in the cabin. The clink of glass, the sound of ice, dropping, the steady pour of wine, all repeated over and over at the other seats, except his. Evan pressed the call button. The light turned on. Lindsay looked directly at him, then turned away. He pressed it again. A young flight attendant approached, but Lindsay immediately cut her off with a tilt of the head and a whispered instruction that made the girl step back. Invisible doors slammed shut. Not because of policy, but because Lindsay willed it. The air around Evan thickened, not with anger, but with familiarity, the kind that comes from a lifetime spent in a society that demands he prove he is invisible before proving he deserves to be seen. He leaned back, eyes observing every movement in the cabin. In the seat across from him, Grant Wallace, Chief Executive Officer of rival company Wallace Cyber Systems, watched him with a discomforting hint of satisfaction, as if he knew what was coming, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Evan sent a message to Caleb. The plan is on track. She is walking into the trap herself. Caleb responded immediately. Record everything. Do not interfere. Let them expose themselves. Evan set his phone aside and took a slow breath. Layers of emotion pressed against him, contempt, separation, dismissal. But none of it pushed him down. It only sharpened him. A group of passengers whispered among themselves, glancing toward him. One man muttered, "Probably an accidental upgrade." Another added, "Doesn't look like a first-class type." The words sliced through the air like a dull blade, not sharp enough to wound deeply, but painful enough to be felt. Lindsay returned with a tray of drinks. The champagne glimmered beautifully under the cabin lights. She leaned toward seat 2, be then 2, see offering service with a voice soft as wind against glass. Then she turned to Evan, the smile gone. "You do not need anything yet, right?" It was not a question. It offered no choice. It was a denial wrapped in fake politeness. Evan did not answer. He looked at her, a gaze steady enough that Lindsay looked away first. A small moment, but the first crack in her armor. Believing she had regained control, Lindsay walked off, gripping the tray tightly, as if it were a shield protecting her from a fear she had not yet recognized. The cabin door closed. The aircraft began to taxi. In that instant, Evan understood the flight would not be peaceful. He felt it in his breath, sensed it in the quiet tension of the cabin. A battle was approaching. A battle Lindsay believed she was initiating. She had no idea the shot had been fired long ago, and the one controlling the entire battlefield was sitting right in front of her, silent, still listening like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment. Evan discreetly adjusted his tie clip. The small, simple piece of metal looked like a decorative accessory, but hidden inside was a high-resolution camera, capturing every face, every word, every act of discrimination that no one would be able to deny. Caleb sent another message. The last 2 times were microaggressions. This time it will be direct evidence. Wait for the moment. Evan looked around at the passengers relaxing in their seats. They did not know they were about to become witnesses to an uncomfortable truth, a truth that the airline industry had sugar-coated for far too long, a truth that would be stripped bare today. A woman in the cabin looked at Evan with sympathy, but she said nothing. No one said anything. This silence was familiar, like the rhythm of society itself, seeing injustice and choosing quiet because it does not touch them personally. But today it would touch everyone. Evan rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes for a few seconds. Not to rest, but to steady his heartbeat, to weaponize his calm. He was not angry. He was not shaken. He was not afraid. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment Lindsay would tighten the noose around her own career. Waiting for the moment the system would expose itself. Waiting for the moment Evan Carter, the man they believed was just another anonymous black passenger, would flip the entire game board with a single phone call. Lindsay approached again. The tray was steady, her expression colder than before. Something in her face signaled a mistake was coming, a mistake she could never undo. Evan opened his eyes, looked directly at her, unblinking. A storm was gathering inside C2A, and Lindsay Parker, unaware and unprepared, was walking straight into its center. Lindsay approached again, the drink tray held tightly between her hands, the faint clink of glassware sounding like a warning of something about to go wrong. Evan lifted his gaze. His eyes were sharp as a blade, cutting through every small movement she made. Lindsay froze for half a beat, then tried to mask it with a forced smile. "Would you like to see the wine list?" Her voice flowed smoothly, in a way that felt strained, as if she were attempting to perform politeness her body could not fully emulate. Evan gave a slight nod. No words. No urgency. His silence unsettled Lindsay more than any spoken answer. She turned away toward the galley, but before disappearing completely, Evan caught the tilt of her head toward another flight attendant, and the whisper laced with mockery. Both women looked in his direction, and a soft laugh escaped them, quick but sharp enough to slice through the air. Evan did not react, but inside fragments of old memories brushed against one another like metal striking metal, not because he was hurt, but because he recognized the pattern. It was a familiar design of petty power, the kind that always targets those they believe have no ability to fight back. Lindsay returned with a glass of deep red Cabernet, but her smile had twisted into something else. Triumph. A small performance she believed would end neatly in her favor. She lifted the glass and stepped toward him, each step firm as if she were carrying a punishment wrapped in sweetness. Evan did not move. He watched closely. The muscles in her face tightened slightly. Her fingers gripped the stem of the glass a little too firmly. A trained flight attendant would never carry wine with such poor control. The stumble was not surprising. The glass tilted. The stream of Cabernet spilled across Evan's shirt. Not slowly, not shakily, not as an accident. The stain bloomed on the white fabric like a wound freshly cut by the hand of the attacker. It spread, sinking into every thread, as though declaring he did not deserve to enter this space clean and unmarked. Passengers gasped. A few turned away. Some bit their lips. Some lowered their heads. They knew it was wrong. They knew what had happened was not a mistake. But they did not want to get involved. Their silence was a silence Evan had known all his life, silence born from fear, avoidance, or the desire not to believe injustice was unfolding right before them. Lindsay leaned in closer, pulling out a tiny napkin, another insult packaged as help. She did not clean, not really. She dabbed lightly, lazily, pretending to assist while pouring fuel onto the fire. "These things sometimes happen," she said, trying to make her voice sound apologetic. But her eyes exposed the cruelty beneath. "I doubt you plan to attend your big meeting looking like this, right?" The words whispered like a cold blade sliding across his throat. Evan heard clearly the soft laugh from the second attendant behind him. Heard the whisper, "He's more suited for the back cabin anyway." Heard the contempt spreading through the air like poison. Years ago, when he was young and new to the industry, words like that would have cut deeper. Now they slid across the steel he had forged from every dismissal he had survived. Evan took out his own cloth from his briefcase and began wiping the stain himself, each movement slow and precise, showing that he needed no help from the person who had just humiliated him. He checked his laptop next, relieved that the waterproof casing had saved it from serious damage. The two attendants kept laughing, kept whispering, kept believing he was powerless. But Lindsay had no idea that the small tie clip on Evan's collar was capturing everything, every laugh, every word, every malicious gesture without a single gap. Evan picked up his phone, his fingers moving quickly. The message sent clear evidence. Entire interaction recorded. Proceed. Caleb replied instantly. Trap sprung. They activated it themselves. An older passenger, across the aisle, leaned slightly toward Evan, speaking softly so no one else would hear. "You do not deserve this." His eyes held a rare kind of understanding Evan seldom encountered in first class. Evan gave a small nod, not because he needed sympathy, but because the man was the only one who dared break the wall of silence. Evan straightened his tie, smoothing the fabric stained by wine. The gestures seemed small, but they carried the weight of a man preparing to enter a courtroom, not one who had merely had wine spilled on him. Because he did not see an accident. He saw a battlefield. Lindsay stood before him, believing she had succeeded, believing she had placed him exactly where she thought he belonged. But she did not know that Evan's silent gaze was the final omen, before a rotten system was about to be torn apart. One small mistake, one drop of wine, one moment of contempt. That was all Evan needed, and Lindsay Parker, in her moment of self-satisfaction, had handed him the key to expose everything Atlas Security had been tracing for 3 months. She believed she was degrading him, but in truth she was ripping open the veil hiding a nationwide pattern of discrimination and data manipulation. Evan looked directly at her, his voice dropping low, not loud, but sharp as a verdict. "You just confirmed everything I needed. Lindsay didn't understand. She couldn't understand, but she would. The entire plane would. The entire airline would. The entire aviation industry would. Because the moment that red wine spread across the shirt of Evan Carter was not an accident. It was the beginning of the downfall of those who believed they could discriminate without ever being seen. Evan stepped into the first-class restroom and closed the door, the mirror reflecting his image, with a spreading red wine stain across his shirt, like a wound he could not hide. But his eyes did not waver. They were sharper, quieter, carrying the dangerous stillness only someone pushed to the limit too many times could possess. He turned on the faucet, dampened a paper towel, and gently wiped the stained fabric. His movements were slow, precise, as if he were examining a crime scene. Each drop of wine sliding down the sink carried echoes of countless moments in his life when he had been underestimated. But today was not like the others. Today, Evan was not just remembering he was recording. The tiny tie-clip camera was still running its 4K lens, capturing every sound, every glance, every malicious word. Every splash of wine on the mirror had now become its evidence, undeniable, unexplainable, impossible to hide. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. A message from Caleb Audio clear. Her entire face is visible. Keep collecting. Evan photographed the stain on his shirt, then the laptop with wine splashed across its surface. The images were instantly uploaded to Atlas's secure servers. The system automatically time-stamped them, matched them with aircraft camera data, cross-referenced with flight path metadata. Every piece of technology Evan had built was now working against the very discrimination he had endured. No one understood how to expose the truth with data better than he did. He looked into the mirror again, not to adjust his appearance, but to see the man he was in this fight. A man no longer guided by emotion, but by strategy, by precision, by purpose. The door rattled gently. A flight attendant attempted to enter, but Evan kept the lock engaged. He needed a few more seconds to ensure everything was in place. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a spare shirt. His eyes examined the wine-soaked fabric meticulously before he changed, as though engraving the memory into his mind. He did not want to forget this feeling. Insult, as he knew well, was the greatest catalyst for justice. When he finished, he placed the stained shirt into a waterproof pouch. It was no longer clothing. It was evidence. Then he turned to the laptop. The wine that had seeped into the keyboard edges was still damp. Evan photographed each angle, each trace of damage. These images alone could form the basis of the property harmed during discriminatory conduct, a claim no airline dared ignore. He dialed Caleb. "What did she say after spilling the wine?" Evan asked, voice low, steady, unshaken. Caleb responded immediately. She said, "He cannot attend any important meeting looking like that. Maybe he should sit where he belongs, in the back." A beat of silence, then Caleb added, and her colleague laughed. "The audio is crystal clear." Evan closed his eyes briefly. Not from pain, but because the final pieces had fallen into place. "It is time," he said. Caleb understood instantly. Alerting legal now. All evidence from the past 3 months is being consolidated. When you land in California, we will have enough to bring down the entire system. Evan ended the call. He refocused, one deep breath. And when he opened his eyes again, all restraint had sharpened into a focused pressure strong enough to cut through any defense the airline would try to make. He picked up his jacket and opened the door. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted immediately. Some passengers glanced at the red stain still lingering on the sleeve of his vest. Others met his eyes briefly before looking away. A few stared openly, as if watching a film they did not realize they would soon be part of. Grant Wallace sat across the aisle. He glanced at Evan with a smug half-smile, the look of a man who believed he had sabotaged his competitor's meeting. Evan did not look away. His gaze was so cold that Grant had to blink. Lindsay stood by the galley trying to appear professional, but her face betrayed her tension. She did not know what Evan had heard. She did not know what the camera had captured. She did not know the data net tightening around her. She only knew that the man with the red-stained shirt was walking back to his seat, slow, steady head, unbowed, unafraid. And that was not the posture of a victim. It was the posture of someone about to shift the balance of power. Evan sat down, opened his laptop, and reviewed the recordings already uploaded to Atlas. The comments, the laughter, the glances all aligning into a single story. A story of an industry rotting from the inside of power, colluding in silence of prejudice, nurtured and disguised for years. And as the plane lifted off the ground, Evan felt it clearly this flight was not just taking him to his aerotech meeting. It was carrying him into the heart of a confrontation he had spent his entire life preparing to win. In the cabin, Lindsay kept smiling nervously. Passengers remained silent. Grant still wore the wrong smile. Only Evan understood what this moment truly was, the beginning. The moment when a discriminatory system was about to be exposed. The moment when a quiet man, never weak, would turn humiliation into an explosive force that would tear every mask away. Justice does not arrive through shouting. Justice arrives when someone has prepared long enough that nothing can stop it. Evan Carter was ready. Lindsay disappeared from the aisle for nearly 10 minutes, as if stretching the silence into an invisible trap, meant to remind Evan of the place she believed he belonged. But Evan did not waver. He reopened his documents, eyes moving across each line, not to read them, but to steady his breathing, while a storm he himself had set in motion continued forming ahead of him. The overhead lights reflected on his face, creating a cold sheen that separated him from the rest of the cabin. He sat upright, silent, but the silence carried the weight of a warning. Anyone observant enough would see it. Clearly, Evan Carter was not the man being cornered. He was the man watching. And when someone like him watches too long, it means he is preparing to act. Lindsay's footsteps returned. She appeared in the aisle with a strained smile, her hands planted on her hips, as if trying to manufacture authority. But the slight redness along her neck betrayed her. A person frightened and angry at the same time, struggling to contain something she could not control, the creeping realization that she had gone too far, without understanding how deep her mistake truly was. Evan pressed the call button. Call. The light blinked. Lindsay froze for half a second, then reluctantly walked over. "Do you need something else?" she asked, her voice defensive. "I want to review the service protocol," Evan said calmly. "Why were all passengers in the cabin served before me, except me?" Lindsay swallowed. The tiny movement cracked her composure like a hairline fracture across glass. She tried to recover her hardness. "We have different priorities," she replied evasively. "Perhaps you do not understand the first-class service process." Evan tilted his head slightly, and his gaze narrowed the space around her. "Or perhaps you think I do not belong in this cabin?" Lindsay stiffened. A few passengers turned their heads. The silence shifted from comfortable to suffocating, pressing on anyone caught in the middle of it. "You are reading too much into this," she said, her voice trembling. "We treat all passengers equally." Evan placed his hand over the red wine stain, a mark still spread across his shirt, like a truth screaming to be acknowledged. "Your actions have been very consistent," he said slowly, "consistent enough to form a pattern." It was as if he had ripped the mask off her face. Lindsay stepped back half a pace, unable to hide her fear. Not fear of Evan, but fear of what she sensed he had collected. Evan unlocked his phone and swiped the screen. The video clips recorded from his tie clip appeared showing Lindsay's own face, twisted with contempt as she asked, "Are you sure this is your seat?" and the footage of her laughing as she spilled wine on him. Evan turned the screen off. A simple gesture, but the sound felt like a hammer striking steel. "You think I did not hear what you whispered to your colleague?" Evan asked. "Or you think I do not understand the category of person you believed I was?" Lindsay opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her breath shortened. Her eyes flicked toward the passengers, as if searching for rescue, but no one intervened. Their faces watched her like witnesses in a hearing already underway. Evan leaned back, his voice lowering not loud, but sharp as a verdict. "I have sent the full evidence to my office. Your laughter, your insults, your deliberate neglect of protocol while serving only the passengers you believed were more deserving." Lindsay blinked rapidly, breath stuttering. Evan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You did not just spill wine on my shirt, you just spilled your own career." A soft sound came from behind. Grant Wallace shifted in his seat, watching them with curiosity mixed with caution. Evan caught his gaze, and in that brief exchange both men understood the bigger picture. Lindsay was only the visible side of the iceberg. Beneath her were deeper layers, Grant himself, his company, the hidden network behind these orchestrated discriminatory incidents, all now rising into the light. Lindsay closed her eyes for a moment, as if hoping everything would vanish when she opened them again. But when she looked up, Evan was still there, calm as a blade, honed to perfection. And before she could step back again, Evan delivered the line that shifted the entire axis of power. "You are not the first to do this to me, but you will be the last." A shiver rippled through the cabin. Lindsay turned away and hurried toward the galley, her face drained of color. And in that moment, Evan knew the balance of power had started to shift. The system that once relied on silence to suffocate him would now have to face a truth it could no longer hide. One small mistake from Lindsay Parker had triggered a chain reaction no one on this flight had been prepared for, but Evan had been prepared for it for a very long time. Evan observed the first-class cabin as if he were studying a living model of power dynamics, the obedient, the silent, the privileged, and the one person singled out as the exception. He sensed clearly how the atmosphere shifted when Lindsay returned after their confrontation. She walked faster, her shoulders tense, her breath shallow, her eyes avoiding every gaze. She thought moving quickly would free her from the pressure tightening around her. But no speed could outrun the truth. Grant Wallace tilted his head, watching her, then watching Evan. Annoyance flickered in his eyes, mixed with caution. The smug smile he wore earlier was gone. He could feel power shifting, even if he did not yet understand the source. He studied Evan longer now, trying to read meaning in every stillness. But Evan offered him nothing. He sat upright, unmoving, his gaze colder than the overhead light reflecting on his face. The plane trembled lightly as it entered turbulence. The soft clatter of overhead luggage, the rattle of seat belts, and the sharp intake of breath from a few passengers echoed through the cabin. But this tremor was nothing compared to the invisible one spreading through the airline's internal structure, the tremor Lindsay had unknowingly triggered. Evan opened his laptop, but he was not working. The screen glowed just enough to reflect his face, focused, sharp, not angry, but calculating. He reviewed the footage from his tie clip. Every gesture, every mocking smile, every whispered remark from the other attendant, all captured in high resolution, impossible to deny. A notification appeared. A message from Caleb Voice Analysis complete. Clarity is 97%. Prepare for the next step. Evan typed a short reply. Check passenger data. Within seconds, Caleb sent a list of notable individuals on the flight. Evan skimmed through it, then stopped at one name. Emily Vargas, a well-known tech journalist famous for reporting on discrimination scandals in the aviation industry. Evan looked ahead. Emily sat in seat 1C. She had witnessed almost everything. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held the sharpness of someone connecting dots. Evan caught her gaze, and in half a second an unspoken agreement formed. She knew there was a story here. He knew she knew, but it was not yet time for it to erupt. Lindsay tried to steady herself by rearranging the drink tray, but her hands trembled. Each glass chimed against the next, the metallic note thin and sharp, sounding like a warning only she could truly hear. She was falling apart, while Evan remained unmoved, the fixed center of gravity in a collapsing room. A young flight attendant approached Lindsay, whispering something urgently. Lindsay glanced at Evan, her eyes filled with anxiety and resentment. The resentment was not because Evan had done anything wrong. It was because he refused to react the way she expected. He did not yell, did not lash out, did not crumble. He controlled the situation completely. And when someone they look down on maintains control, that is what truly terrifies people like her. She turned away. But Evan heard her clearly, as if she were standing right beside him. I hope he does not make a big deal out of this. People like that always complicate everything. A simple sentence, but potent enough to destroy a career. And she had no idea it had been captured perfectly by Evan's microphone. Evan's lips lifted slightly. Not a smile, but a confirmation. What he needed no longer depended on Lindsay's actions. It depended on her continuing to hurt herself with her own unconscious contempt. Emily Vargas stood up and walked toward Evan's row, not to intervene, but to observe more closely. She bowed her head politely, just enough to acknowledge him without overstepping. I saw something very serious unfold, she said softly. Are you all right? Evan met her gaze directly. I am perfectly all right. She nodded, understanding that the sentence did not mean he was unharmed. It meant he knew exactly what he was doing. Emily did not press further. She only added one short, razor-sharp question. Are you collecting evidence? Evan did not reply. His silence said everything. Emily's lips tightened. Her eyes brightened, as if she had just found the cornerstone of a story larger than anything she had written. Before she turned back to her seat, Evan asked, Have you noticed anything unusual since the beginning of the flight? Emily inhaled lightly, then answered, I have seen a system enabling misconduct, and I have seen that you are not the kind of person they should be playing with. She walked away, leaving behind a single line that made Lindsay glance after her with unease. The plane shook again. The air grew heavier. Evan sensed the rhythm of the moment, the rhythm that signaled everything was approaching the point of no return. He unlocked his phone. A new message from Caleb waited for him. We found what you need. The person behind Lindsay is not just her. Evan closed his eyes for a moment. In that brief darkness, the shape of the coming battle revealed itself. A battle far beyond a spilled drink, far beyond one careless or malicious attendant, far beyond a single airline. A battle against a system that chooses who deserves respect and who does not. He opened his eyes, cold, sharp, clear. The storm was fully formed now. Lindsay was only the first wind. What came next would be the eye of the hurricane. And Evan Carter, the man they thought was an easy target, had just become the one controlling the entire storm. The soft ding of the announcement chimed as the plane steadied after turbulence. But in first class, no one truly relaxed. The air had changed, thicker, heavier, as if everyone could sense something shifting beneath the surface, not in the aircraft, but in the truth. Evan received another message from Caleb, sending a photo. You will want to see this. The file opened, and in an instant, Evan's eyes sharpened. In the picture was Andrew Parker Lindsay's brother, a former data security engineer at National Airlines, a man terminated for serious violations, yet somehow his records had never been released internally. Alongside the photo was a new file Andrew Parker now worked for Wallace Cyber Systems. Evan glanced at Grant Wallace across the aisle. Grant feigned nonchalance, but his fingers tapped the armrest in rapid, nervous bursts. He clearly sensed the curtain being pulled away too quickly. Another message arrived. We found the backdoor code Andrew installed in the airline system. It is still active. Someone has been using it. Evan reread the message twice, not out of disbelief, but because the pieces were locking together, faster than even he anticipated. A discriminatory incident had become a signal. The signal had become a clue. The clue had led to a hidden data network. The system was being manipulated from the inside. Passenger lists accessed illegally. High-ranking executives of color from his company being assigned to specific flights, specific crews, specific moments. There was no doubt now. This was not the isolated bias of one flight attendant. This was a coordinated campaign. Evan typed back, "Trace it completely. I will handle the rest." He closed his phone and breathed slowly, not from stress, but from the clarity crystallizing in his mind. A faint clicking sound emerged from the galley, Lindsay arranging glasses, her hands trembling. She knew something had shifted. She could not name it, but she felt her confidence evaporating like steam on glass. Evan stood up. The soft release of the seatbelt buckle was sharp enough to feel like a warning bell. Lindsay looked up, startled. Another attendant stepped forward, as if to intervene, but Evan lifted his hand, calm and minimal, not threatening, not aggressive, just the unmistakable gesture of someone entirely in control. He approached Lindsay with a composure so steady it was unnerving. "I need to speak with you," Evan said, his voice low, and measured each word set down like metal on a steel table. Lindsay swallowed hard. "Are you trying to file a complaint? I already apologized." "You never apologized," Evan cut in. His tone did not rise, but the force of it rippled through the tight galley. "You did not forget the glass of wine. You did not forget the whisper. You did not forget the way you looked at me when I stepped into this cabin." Lindsay flushed a mix of anger and fear, twisting her expression. "I have nothing against you," she insisted weakly. "It was just a misunderstanding." Evan fixed his gaze on her. "You have a problem with people like me." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. "He should be sitting in the back cabin." Evan repeated her exact words. That was a misunderstanding. Lindsay opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. A bead of sweat slid down her temple. Evan continued. "You have done this to 3 other black passengers in the past 2 months. Every incident recorded. Every incident showing the same pattern." Lindsay's eyes widened. No one outside Atlas's investigation team knew about those cases. She had never been confronted. No report had ever reached her. But Evan knew. He watched true panic flash across her face. How do you? Evan did not answer. His silence told her everything she feared. She was not the only one being observed. The entire system had been exposed long before she realized it. A ding sounded as the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers shifted slightly, as if the whole cabin unconsciously sensed this was a turning point. Evan stepped back half a pace and swept his gaze across the cabin. People were watching. Some avoided his eyes. Others did not dare move. Grant Wallace clutched his bag strap tighter, his eyes flickering with the panic of someone who recognized the shape of the storm heading straight for him. Evan returned to his seat, but before he sat, he delivered one sentence that sent the cabin into utter silence. "I do not need you to admit anything. I only need you to understand that this will not end on the aircraft." Lindsay recoiled as if pushed by an invisible force. Evan sat down, opened his laptop, and the blue glow illuminated his face. There was no trace of offense left. Only the terrifying composure of a man who saw the entire board. The plane continued gliding through the sky, but inside first class it felt as if they had entered colder, tighter air, where every word, every glance, every action was being recorded, analyzed, and prepared for exposure. Evan received one final message from Caleb in this sequence. We know why they targeted you. And why they targeted every powerful black executive. Evan placed a hand on the screen. His eyes darkened, sharpened. He had known this was no small incident. But now he understood it was the doorway into a rotting system where discrimination was not just a personal bias, but a tool serving a much larger scheme. He inhaled deeply. The battle was about to move beyond the outer ring, and from this moment on, Evan Carter was no longer the one being wronged. He was the investigator, the one holding the advantage, the one they should never have touched. Evan opened the message. A compressed file appeared containing system logs, access codes, and hundreds of data fragments pulled from National Airlines servers. Every trail led to the same point. The back door created by Andrew Parker had been accessed most frequently, right before flights carrying black executives from Atlas or from competing tech companies targeted by Wallace Cyber Systems. Another message from Caleb appeared instantly short, but enough to change the entire center of the conflict. They are using airline data to pick targets. This is a strategic attack, not random. Evan sat still for a few seconds, not from shock, but because the final answer had arrived. He had suspected it for a long time. Lindsay was only one small limb of a much larger creature. The incidents involving Maya Brooks, Leon Wright, Alicia Morgan, all of them had been pre-selected, pre-calculated, arranged for the right flight, the right hour, the right crew. Lindsay never needed to know the bigger picture. She was only a tool easy to manipulate because she believed her behavior was justified, ordinary deserved. A perfect instrument in the hands of someone who knew how to weaponize her unconscious prejudice. Evan looked toward Grant Wallace, who was pretending to focus on his tablet, but his fingers trembled. His eyes flicked briefly toward Evan before darting away, the sign of a man who sensed that the wall he built had begun to crack. Evan opened the decrypted voice file Caleb sent him. It was a recording extracted from National's internal system, a deep male voice saying, "Just make them look unprofessional, not dangerous, just inconvenient. They will lose the contract before they understand what happened." Another voice replied, "Someone like Carter at the head of the table. A little red wine will remind him of his place." Everything inside Evan went quiet. Not explosive, not angry, just quiet. The kind of quiet that is dangerous like the sea before it rises. He closed his laptop. His face held no expression, yet anyone who looked closely would see the truth. His silence was a verdict not yet spoken. Evan stood again. Several passengers startled not from the sound, but because the pressure around him felt different. Lindsay, watching from afar, instinctively backed toward the galley. Evan did not look at her. He walked past seat 1, where Emily Vargas observed the unfolding events. As he passed, she said softly, without turning her head, "The pattern is starting to show." Evan replied, "You have not seen the worst part." He continued forward until he stopped at Grant Wallace's seat. Grant looked up, forcing a smile, trying to stay in character, but his hand tightened around the armrest. Evan leaned slightly closer, his voice, low meant only for the two of them, yet heavy enough for the entire cabin to feel its vibration. "Do you know how they selected me?" Grant said nothing. Evan continued. "They used the stolen National Airlines data. The back door written by Andrew Parker. Your employee." Grant tried to look composed. "I think you are misunderstanding." No, Evan cut him off, his voice as sharp as a blade. "I understand perfectly, and you should choose your next words carefully." A silence stretched thin as a bowstring. Evan stared straight at him, then added, "They did not just want me to miss a meeting. They wanted Atlas to lose the Aerotech contract. And you stand to lose a great deal if Wallace Cyber Systems fails." Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came out. Evan stepped back, looking down at him. "You thought this was a clever, dirty trick. But you forgot the simplest thing." Grant swallowed hard. "What is that?" Evan spoke without emotion, yet the force hit like a blow to the chest. "You chose the wrong person to attack." Someone in the row behind dropped a pen. No one spoke, but every eye in the cabin was fixed on them. Evan turned away before Grant could react. He returned to his seat with the posture of someone no longer under attack, but someone directing an investigation. Emily approached this time without hiding her concern. "You said back door. Do you mean the airline system was breached?" Evan looked at her and didn't deny it. "And used to target people like me." Emily inhaled sharply. Her voice dropped. "If that is true, this is no longer a discrimination story. This is market manipulation. Not just the market," Evan corrected. "Identity. Power. The career paths of dozens of people." She paused for a few seconds, then asked, "What do you need me to do?" Evan answered immediately, "Watch, and remember, the most important part will happen when we land." Emily nodded. No further questions. Lindsay appeared at the front of the cabin, trying to gather herself, but the moment her eyes met Evan's, all her remaining confidence shattered. She turned away quickly, as if his gaze alone could reveal the secrets she was trying to hide. Another message from Caleb appeared. Evan listened carefully. "CEO Harold Benton is being brought onto the plane after an emergency stop. They want to intervene before you land." Evan set his phone down, feeling the cabin tremble once more. This time, not from turbulence, but from the weight of a system about to be overturned. At the front row, Lindsay tried to steady a tray of water glasses, but her hands shook so violently the glassware clinked in panic. Grant watched her with fearful eyes. Evan sat back down and fastened his seatbelt. The storm was close now. The aircraft continued cutting westward through the sky, but no one in the cabin understood that it was carrying something far more dangerous than turbulence. The truth. And when the truth falls, none of them will remain standing as they were before. The plane began to descend the engine tone, shifting as the first-class cabin trembled lightly. No one knew what awaited them on the ground, but Evan did. Caleb's message still glowed on his screen. CEO Harold Benton was preparing to board. That could mean only one thing. National Airlines had sensed danger. They wanted to silence him before he could set foot in San Francisco. The cabin lighting changed as the aircraft entered emergency descent procedures. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, though none understood the real reason. Lindsay tried to force a reassuring smile, but her trembling hands exposed her. Grant Wallace looked around with the panic of a man trapped in the very snare he helped build. Evan fastened his seatbelt. He appeared calm, as if this were a routine landing, but inside his mind was moving at a pace no analytics team could match. Every piece was locking into place. Andrew's back door, Lindsay's behavior, Grant's presence, the company's sudden response. A massive system had realized it was being watched, and it was scrambling to protect itself. The plane shook again. A small scream came from the back cabin. Lindsay grabbed the armrest, inhaling sharply. Evan kept his gaze forward, breathing steady. His calmness destabilized the entire tension in the air. The plane hit the runway with a heavy jolt. Some passengers sighed in relief, others gasped. But Evan did not react. He looked out the window where the fading Denver sunlight cast the airport like a stage waiting for its curtain to rise. When the plane came to a full stop, the door opened, and a group of airport staff stepped aboard. Their steps were quick, purposeful. Passengers whispered anxiously. Lindsay froze. And then Harold Benton, the CEO of National Airlines, boarded the aircraft. A cold silence spread instantly. Benton was tall, silver-haired, with eyes trained more for commanding than listening. He swept his gaze across first class, unable to hide a flicker of irritation at the chaos. Then his attention landed on Evan. And stayed. Longer than necessary. Evan did not stand. He did not bow or greet him. He simply met Benton's gaze with a steady, unflinching stare. Two men facing each other like the opposing forces of a battle not yet ignited, but already decided. Benton broke the silence first. "We received a report of a serious incident," he said. "I have a few questions for you," Evan replied, voice calm as midnight water. "And I have a few answers you will not like." Lindsay looked between them, her face pale as paper. Grant lowered his head, wishing he could disappear. The passengers held their breath. Benton stepped closer, standing beside Evan. "Do you have anything you want to report?" His voice was controlled, but the strain underneath was unmistakable. Evan opened his laptop. The simple gesture carried the weight of dropping a verdict onto steel. On the screen played video with perfect clarity, down to the millisecond Lindsay, questioning whether he belonged in the cabin. Lindsay smirking. Lindsay spilling wine. Lindsay whispering. Lindsay saying he should sit in the back cabin. Not a single sound escaped the camera. Benton watched. With each passing second, his face drained of color. Evan did not need to explain. The footage spoke for itself. This, Evan said, voice low, is systemic discrimination. And this, he switched to the logs Caleb had sent, is proof that your company was infiltrated for years. The air froze. Andrew Parker's back door, Evan continued, was used to target black executives on multiple flights. For months, a loud clatter sounded. Lindsay had dropped a tray of water. Benton turned toward her, his stare like a blade. "Is that true?" Lindsay could not answer. Her body curled inward, trembling like a leaf in wind. Evan met the CEO's eyes. "Do you know the worst part of all this?" Benton said nothing. Not that the data was stolen. Not that your employee discriminated. But that you never saw it happening. Because your system allowed it. Benton gripped his briefcase tightly. "What do you want, Carter?" Evan closed the laptop, his gaze piercing through Benton as though through metal. "I want the truth exposed. I want your system changed. And I want no one like me to ever go through this again." Benton said nothing. Something in his expression cracked a silent acknowledgement, or the beginning of a collapse. Lindsay leaned weakly against the aisle wall, her face drained of all color. Grant stared at the floor, realizing the game had spiraled beyond his control. Evan leaned back in his seat, his stillness radiating a force that pushed everyone else into retreat. Then he spoke the final sentence, the one that sealed the moment. "The game is over. Now it is my turn." The plane remained still on the Denver tarmac, but everyone understood that this moment was the pivot point, the place where a discriminated passenger became the man leading one of the biggest investigations the airline industry had ever faced. And the battle had only just begun. From the perspective of a systemic justice expert, Evan's story shows that injustice never begins at the moment a glass of wine is spilled. It begins within a structure of power, long accustomed to judging people through prejudice, then sustaining itself through silence. Evan's true strength does not lie in anger, but in his ability to turn insult into data, turn bias into evidence, and transform a personal incident into a strike against an entire decaying system. If you believe that justice requires people who are willing to stand up and stand up in the right way, please like and subscribe to help spread these awakening stories to even more viewers. And leave a short comment. Stand up.